The year is 1994. You worked hard, saved up, and now you've got real money in your pocket for the first time in your life. Which means one thing: you need a car that announces your success the moment you roll back into your hometown. You think about a Lamborghini Diablo, but you need to save something for the marble lions on the front gate. The Mazda 323F is genuinely tempting, but 3 of your immigrant neighbors already showed up in one last summer. You consider the BMW 85i. But in the end, you go black Honda NSX. Here's the thing: no matter which of those you picked, you would not have made a mistake, because every single one of them had the greatest design detail in automotive history. A detail that is, effectively, banned today: pop-up headlights. Most people associate pop-ups with the 80s and 90s, which makes sense, because that's when they were everywhere. But the actual origin goes back much further, all the way to 1936, and a car called the Cord 810. The 1930s were when car manufacturers first got serious about aerodynamics. In 1933, Cadillac literally named one of their cars the Aerodynamic. In 1934, Chrysler released the Airflow, but there was a smaller American brand, Auburn Cord, that wanted to take the whole aerodynamics idea further than anyone else. They started with sweeping curved fenders and flowing body lines, but then they went one step further. They hid the headlights entirely, borrowing the mechanism from a small aircraft. You lifted them manually with a lever. That's it. It sounds primitive, but aesthetically, it was decades ahead of its time. It looked like nothing else on the road. It felt futuristic in a way that most cars never manage. The Cord 810 didn't sell well, so it didn't immediately influence the industry, but the idea was planted. Over the next few decades, similar concepts appeared here and there, but nothing stuck. Then, in 1962, the Lotus Elan arrived and changed everything. Lotus used a vacuum system. Engine pressure raised the headlights while the car was running, and they dropped automatically when you switched the engine off. Simple, elegant, occasionally leaky, sometimes slow, but it worked. And more importantly, it looked incredible. The Elan was already a beautiful car, a classic British roadster, genuinely ahead of its time. The pop-up lights were a huge part of why. They preserved the clean lines of the hood, instead of breaking them up with bulky fixed lights. No coincidence that the Elan was the main inspiration for the Mazda MX-5, another perfect sports car, another perfect set of pop-ups. A year later, the C2 Corvette arrived and gave the world arguably the most iconic pop-up lights ever put on a production car. And then, in 1966, Lamborghini did what Lamborghini does, took an idea and made it completely insane. The Lamborghini Miura is still considered the first true supercar. It had to have pop-up lights, obviously, but the way they did it was special. When the bulbs were off, the lenses sat completely flush with the hood, invisible, perfectly integrated. When you turned them on, they rose out of frames designed to look like eyelids or eyelashes, depending on who you ask. The result helped define one of the most beautiful front ends in automotive history, a triangular, almost predatory face that still looks modern today. The lights weren't just a detail on the Miura, they were part of the identity. The Miura's success made pop-ups aspirational. If the world's most beautiful supercar had them, everyone wanted them. What really accelerated their spread in the 70s and 80s was the shift from rounded to sharp design language. Wedge shapes, hard lines, aggressive angles. Pop-up lights fit that aesthetic perfectly, because when they were closed, you got a clean surface. When they opened, you got drama. Ferrari's 308 and 328 defined what a sports car was supposed to look like for an entire generation. The Testarossa cemented the connection between pop-ups and Italian performance cars so thoroughly that the two became almost synonymous. Even Porsche, one of the most conservative design houses in the business, couldn't resist. The 928 adopted lights with a clear nod to the Miura's eyelid design. If Porsche is doing it, you know something has become mainstream. But my personal favorite? The Opel GT. Not just because of how they look, but because because of the movement. The way they rotate out is unlike anything else. I remember as kids, we used to beg owners of 323Fs to open and close the lights just so we could watch. Can you imagine what the Opel GT would have done to us? The car that probably did the most to democratize pop-up lights was the Mazda RX-7, late 70s, affordable, Japanese, and deeply cool. It proved that pop-up lights weren't just for Italian exotics or American muscle. They worked on accessible sports cars too, and that opened the floodgates. Then, the AE86 arrived, the NSX, the Supra, the MX-5. By the late 80s, pop-up lights were simply the default setting for anything with a sporty pretension. To give you a sense of the scale, Car and Driver picked the 16 best coupes of 1989. 11 of them had pop-up headlights, 11 out of 16, and the obsession went deeper than that. There was an aftermarket company making pop-up fog lights specifically for the AE86. Pop-up fog lights. I don't know if anything cooler has ever existed. While we're in the 80s, the C4 Corvette deserves a special mention. Unlike most pop-ups that open forward, the C4s rotated backward, giving the whole action a more dramatic, almost theatrical quality. Combined with that flat, low hood, the effect was genuinely unlike anything else. The Corvette also holds the record. Pop-up headlights from the C2 in 1963 all the way to the C5 in 2004. 41 years, the last car ever produced with them. Before we leave this era, two BMWs that need to be mentioned if you live anywhere near the Balkans. The M1, one of the most valuable BMWs ever made, currently trading above €500,000, and the 8 Series, the car everyone still wants and nobody can justify. Here's where it gets slightly complicated, because the common answer is wrong. Pop-up headlights were never actually banned. There is no regulation anywhere that says pop-up headlights are illegal. What happened is more subtle than that. European pedestrian safety regulations began requiring that the front surface of a car's hood be designed to minimize injury in a collision, and when pop-up lights are raised, they create rigid, protruding surfaces directly in the impact zone. Hard metal edges sticking up from the hood. Not good. Could you design around it? Theoretically, yes. But nobody has found a solution that also looks good. And since the European market is too important to ignore, what doesn't work in Europe doesn't get made anywhere. For context, the Tesla Cybertruck is probably the most dangerous vehicle for pedestrians built since the cars in Mad Max, which is exactly why it will almost certainly never be approved for sale in Europe. But safety wasn't the only factor. Aerodynamics, the same science that made pop-ups cool in the first place, also helped kill them. When raised and in use, they created measurable drag. As fuel economy regulations tightened, that became harder to justify. Technology moved on too. Polycarbonate lenses, xenon, and eventually LED lighting meant you could get better light output from a fixed, integrated design than from a mechanical pop-up. The engineering case for keeping them got weaker every year. And then there was the cultural shift. By the late 90s, rounded, organic design was back in fashion. Pop-ups started looking dated rather than futuristic. The Honda NSX lost its pop-up lights with the refresh. The Ferrari Testarossa became the 512M. Both cars, visually, never quite recovered. So, what's your favorite? Drop it in the comments. If you want to support the channel, like and subscribe. And go check out my last video on why new cars are so ugly.